Well, welcome to the fly-through of module number 8. So this really puts it all together. This is all about sort of consolidating our information and knowledge and connecting all the dots, so to speak. So let's go through it. Here is some differentiation summaries that I found that I think you find particularly useful, because we've really been focusing about differentiation, focusing about how to meet the learner need and be different in how we teach. So let's click at one here. So if we read this one here, so I asked you to watch the video, download the poster, but here's some 20 examples, and I'll skim through that. Look, they look at the content, process, and product as the domains, which is the framework of differentiation we've been talking about. Learning stations, task cards, interviewing students, not necessarily differentiation in the sense of teaching, but then you get to know the student and you actually have a data story on them. VARC. Throughout the lessons, we stressed about those using modality in how you teach. Sharing your own strength and weakness is not necessarily differentiation, but it's creating conducive learning environments, and maybe that learning environment domain of where you are talking about resilience and strength and perseverance. Think, pair, share, one of those collaborative TAPs or collaborative learning areas. Journaling allows for critical thinking, not necessarily differentiation, but allows for great learning. Implement goal setting similarly for students to stop, reflect and pause and build upon their learning. And run literature circles, which is another sort of group activity that you can do. And that can be built around, also around interest, can be built around levels. Other types of free study, again building upon journey and reflection, and fits well with the I do, you do, we do, you do, although not necessarily differentiation unless you do something in the free time. Similar learning styles, you can group. And how you group students is a big part of differentiation. It may not be necessarily learning styles, it could be also different levels that you use. Comprehension, reading is an example where often different levels are applied and different tasks and complexity are utilised. Open-ended assignments allow your higher end to thrive, allows those time and space for those other students to be supported at the bottom end of your academic readiness. And choice. Big part of differentiation. Analyse your own strategies, for example, is good for your professional development. Teach up, create high expectations, ensure that you're tiering upwards. Here's some IT engagements that you can use to help for individualised programs. Personal interest, this is obviously focusing on their product, but it goes through and talks about all the different differentiation ideas that you can have. So review those things. Where do we go? Now, this is our lectures proper. The GTPA, it's a responsive teaching cycle strategy, isn't it? Or assessment, where you're losing teaching by varying the content, varying the process and product in response to students' readiness, interest and learning profile. And you'll reflect and you'll praise the impact. They're the phases of the GTPA. But be mindful also that you're also going to be doing the QPEF document, which is your interim report, and your final report. Only need to submit your final report. And here it talks about the context of what you're doing, and then it goes through and looks at all the APSTs for planning. And they're grouped, you notice there's 1, 2s and 3s that are there. You have to achieve graduate or above, that's exceeding, and developing or below, and developing are not sufficient, as this is your capstone task. So it's going to be assessing through all those things. But if you plan effectively, if you're doing GPA effectively, you're going to be planning effectively. You're going to be teaching effectively. And notice there's 2s and 3s predominantly through there. APS4s in managing the classroom. 5s in assessing and recording and giving feedback for students, or the APS V5s. Professional conduct drawn from a range of areas where you're going to be that practicing professional. Things that may not be covered because of the context are those ones there. So that's going to be your interim report. You need to get that, make sure, by end of week 2, beginning of week 3, so that you've got a really idea that you're hitting the mark in terms of those things. So talk with your mentor about that. This is what we talked about proper in terms of our GTPA. We use this framework where there's initial data collect, and then there's a cycle of data, reflect and analyse, plan, teach, collect some data, whether that's a work sample, whether that's a quiz or some observational data, and then you reflect on that and you plan. But it's also across the whole unit of work, and it's continuous. And it's got the collecting phase and the responding phase. And you collect data of different types. We talked about quantitative, number-based data. It could be letter-based data, A, B, C, D, or qualitative, which is observational data or descriptive data that you might have, and survey data can deliver that. And you do, and also your assessment, the formative assessment, continuous assessment, and summative assessment are all data collects. We're collecting on readiness, interest, and passion. They're our domains, learning profile, they're our domains of learning, and you're going to then transfer it to how you teach, your content, process, product, etc. So you have to have, in your initial week, you're going to collect all those things. And here's some tools to do it. Getting to know them, this pre-assessments, check for understandings. Now those pre-assessments may be at the beginning of the unit, but also along the way of, you might use some of these tools that are there. So if you use all those, you're going to have a great scope of data collects that you're going to do. And of course, why? Because we need to understand our students so that we can vary the content, vary our strategies, vary how students produce their work, and create an conducive learning environment. This is a graphic that we used throughout, and that's to illustrate the point that most of it's going to be on at year level expectations. But you're going to have significant extension and significant support, but not all the time. But you're going to have to do some of those things. And notice it's got breadth and depth. So you've got breadth and depth here of complexity and deepening, and it's simplification of breadth and depth for your supported learners. That goes for your content selection, that goes for the processes that you use. There's an increase in options, and there's a sort of a consolidation of options at the lower end. So use that concept to say, okay, that's how I'll be differentiation. Most of my teaching will still be in the middle there. In content differentiation, we talked about tiering, the different levels that you provide for learning. Scaffolding is associated with content differentiation, where you'll support and have different levels of scaffold for different levels of students. We also taught you're selecting content on different modalities, the visual, auditory, reading, and kinesthetic. This here, the table here, represents how we make sure that when we're planning, we're teaching up. And we're cognizant that if you look at what does the advanced level look like, it helps us then unpack what other areas we'll have to provide for. Process differentiation, here's all our teaching strategies, and they're things that are the way we teach. And are they different? Rotations, working stations, learning menus can be utilised for all the different readiness levels, all the interest levels, or learning profile levels. We can use tools like graphic organisers and tic-tac-toe, which is basically a choice board. All those things, the TAPS area about collaborative learning, how we organise our groups, all related to differentiated practice. And you put the range of those and sprinkle them, salt and pepper, through your teaching. And here's how TAPS looks. These are perhaps some of the best ways of using TAPS for the different modalities that you're using, whether it's a small pair or alone. Product differentiation may have the opportunity to do this, and you can use learning menus and modalities and choice to get the outcome. In other words, how can the student demonstrate their learning? Now, it might be at the end of the unit, but also it can be in your class. Can they do a little presentation as opposed to write something, for example? Can they make something as opposed to that writing something? Now, you will have writing as well, but just if you can mix it up in terms of what you are expecting students to do, that would assist them. Now, putting it together, I say, well, let's break this down, differentiation story down into, say, threes. So if we think of 3 modes, let's have a look at visual, auditory, kinesthetic, written, and perhaps using ICT as a mode of engagement with the learning. And I think you can do 2 of those per lesson. Without even thinking about it, I think you're already doing it. And if you look at 3 levels, high, on, and low, and we're using tiering and scaffolding to support those different levels that you have. Now, you might not use that intentionally every lesson, but you'll be surprised how often you use it. And maybe every second lesson we aim for that. And 3 formats: group work, rotations, TAPS, choice, all those things, how we organise the mechanics and logistics of learning in our classroom. And we use 3 formats. Maybe not every lesson, but, well, sorry, if I do, you do, we do, you do, then there's formats there. But, are we going to have rotations? Not every lesson, but, sprinkled throughout. And if we put those 3 things together, 3 modes, 3 levels, 3 formats, and we've got a huge range of things that we are starting to meet the learner needs. And having that variety is actually making us a rich learning environment and a rich teacher. So break it down into threes. Coming back to the cycles, that's where you get your data will inform that cycle and meet the learning needs if you're breaking things down in threes. And the meta-narrative, I just go crazy about this. I love it. But let's have a look at the GTP8, how this data-informed process works. Well, section number 1 is getting you to collect data, discuss the data, and plan. Section number 2 is, and so from that planning, I'm going to teach. And section number 3 is, okay, I'm going to assess along the way, and also at the end, what's the outcome? Each set of lessons and the unit as a whole. Section number 4 asks us to critically reflect upon it. Now that is not just reflect on how you went, but reflect upon the data. Reflect upon the planning of teaching, reflect upon the assessment, and the last section says, what would I do now in the future, project to the future. You might want to use the plus, minus, and interesting model of analysis. So when you reflect upon it, what was positive about this? What was negative or deficient about this? And what was interesting? What would I perhaps do differently? And if you did that for your data, for your planning and teaching, if you did that for your assessment, then that's you actually got a really good framework in which you can discuss and reflect upon. The last section is about the scenarios. It's about putting it all together. You're going to have 2 scenarios, and you're going to have them as illustrative examples of your whole differentiated teaching cycle, where you're going to talk about the whole class. Whole class, here's my data. This is how I thought about it. Here's my analysis of it. Here's the planning and teaching that came out of that data. And here's the outcome. So you do whole class. And then you'll zoom in a bit and see your focus student. And you get more precise and tight. Here's the focus students. Here's their needs. Here's their particular emphasis of learning. And therefore I taught this way, and this is what the outcome that is there. So that's the difference. It's the whole story. It's not just a snapshot lesson. You might use a showcase lesson to illustrate, here's how I taught, but you as an illustrative example, but you put it all, the whole data through to outcome together. But also the GTP8 is an evidence-based analytical narrative. So what do we have evidence in section number 1? Well, the evidence are going to be data tables, survey results and instruments that you used, and also the unit plan for your planning that you used, with maybe integrated assessment and numeracy and literacy. And then how is going to write? What's the writing style? Well, it's going to be explicit language. We've got to hear your analysis through explicit thinking, and you've got to have an academic justification for the choices you then forecast that you would use. So that's the writing style. Now let's have a look at section number 2. Well, the evidence will be lesson plan segments to demonstrate your planning. And then for demonstrate your teaching, you'll use perhaps the lesson segments and annotate them, but also worksheets that you might use, or other resources that you use to demonstrate how you've taught differentially. And the writing style will say you'll describe your strategy, but you must connect it back to your data, which is really what task 1 was about. And then what was its impact? And you look at one of the exemplars where it's explicitly got those 3 sort of headings and paragraphs in each elaboration of each strategy they use. Section number 3 has a number of sub-criteria, and you have to have a range of assessment. So, or your formative assessment that you've put in and utilised as an evidence that. You need to also evidence your feedback samples, written and verbal. And collate verbal feedback. And you notice, particularly for the younger years, then you're going to have a lot more verbal feedback and observational data that you'll have to collate and use that as your assessment, as opposed to written data that students perhaps are too young to write or read or in a complex way. So you'll construct your observational and your verbal feedback into data points. And how will you write? You'll write extensively about the summative task and the moderation process, and there's some mandated forms for that. In section number 4, as I've discussed, there's no particular evidence. It's really about your critical analysis that you're going to use and how you reflect upon the distinct areas. Likewise, in section number 5, you're going to do some critical analysis, but there is evidence, because you're going to do the academic before and after. If you're going to praise impact, you've got to say where they ended up, but where do they start? So you're going to have initial test data, pre-testing, or initial data collects that you have some work samples, or immediately previous reports that you could use to show where they are now compared to where they were previously. So that's going to be part of that meta-narrative that you put down for each scenario. And you're going to write down and say, the data said this, therefore I planned and taught that, and the outcome was, and how, was it effective, and how it was effective. Now, you're not going to put that in one paragraph. You're going to write a paragraph about data. You're going to write a paragraph or two about how you planned and taught, and you're going to write a paragraph about your cognitive commentary about the outcome that you'll use, and then you'll comment throughout that about this effectiveness of these things together. So it'll be evidence-based and it'll be analytical. So that is our fly-through of everything that we've done across the course. So hopefully you've enjoyed the course and you feel now prepared as you go into your final capstone PEP and your GTPA.